August 31, 2016. Ports around the world start receiving a message. And the message is simple. Don't let those ships in. Not because of a storm, not because of a war, not because of a disease. Because one company, a company that moved 3% of everything shipped across the Pacific, had just run out of money. And nobody had a plan for what happened next. 66 ships, 540,000 containers, $14 billion in cargo, Samsung TVs, Nike sneakers, Christmas toys, medical equipment, all of it floating. By the end of that week, sailors on stranded vessels were running out of food. Ports in California, Spain, China, Panama, all refusing entry. And in boardrooms from Seoul to Rotterdam, executives were discovering something terrifying. They had no idea how fragile the system really was. This is the story of Hanjin Shipping, the biggest collapse in the history of container shipping. And at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you something about what happened after that almost nobody talks about. August 31, 2016. A Tuesday morning. In the offices of the Korea Development Bank in Seoul, a decision had already been made. A quiet decision. The kind that doesn't make headlines until everything falls apart. They were pulling their support for Hanjin Shipping. The money was gone. The patience was gone. And with one filing in the Seoul Central District Court, the 7th largest container shipping company in the world ceased to function. In less than 24 hours, ports across the planet would start turning away Hanjin's ships. Not because of a disaster, not because of a war, simply because nobody could guarantee payment for the crews who would unload the cargo, or the docking fees, or the fuel. It sounds bureaucratic, almost boring. It wasn't. By September 1st, 66 of Hanjin's ships were in open water with nowhere to go. 45 of them were simply anchored in international waters, outside ports that refused entry. Others were mid-ocean, still en route when the news reached their captains. The orders they received were contradictory, confusing, or simply absent. Continue? Return? Anchor? For the sailors on board, the answer was terrifying. Wait. And what were they waiting with? $14.5 billion in cargo, Samsung televisions, Nike shoes, Christmas gifts, spare parts for hospitals, food. All of it floating, all of it stuck. But to understand why this happened, we have to go back. Back to 1977. Back to Seoul. Back to when a family decided they were going to build one of the greatest shipping empires in history.
The Hanjin Group didn't start with ships. It started with trucks. In 1945, right after World War II ended, a Korean businessman named Cho Jung-hoon founded a small trucking company to help rebuild a country in ruins. He called it Hanjin Transportation. The timing was interesting. Korea was devastated. The economy was almost non-existent. But Cho saw what others didn't. A country rebuilding needs things moved. And he was going to move them. The company grew fast. By the 1960s, Hanjin was supplying logistics services to U.S. military forces during the Vietnam War. That contract was worth millions. It transformed a small trucking company into a serious logistics player. And in 1969, the Hanjin Group acquired something that would change everything: Korean Air. The family was building a conglomerate, a chaebol, the Korean word for the massive family-controlled business empires that would come to define South Korea's economic miracle. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Hanjin. These weren't just companies, they were dynasties. And in 1977, the Hanjin Group launched its container shipping division, Hanjin Container Lines. The timing again was smart. In 1977, global container shipping was still relatively young. The containerization revolution, the standardized metal box that would transform global trade, had only been around since the 1950s. The routes were established, but competition was still limited. Hanjin entered routes to the Middle East, then the U.S. West Coast.
By 1983, they were running weekly services to California. Weekly, in 1983. Think about what that means. A ship leaving Korea every 7 days, loaded with Korean products, arriving in Los Angeles. This was the physical infrastructure of the globalization that was just beginning. By the 1990s, Hanjin hit a milestone that made headlines in Korea, forced Korean shipping company to reach sales of over 1 trillion won. They were building something real, something massive. And somewhere along the way, they forgot that real and massive doesn't mean invincible. But before we get to what went wrong, I need to show you the world Hanjin was navigating. Because the collapse of 2016 didn't start in 2016. It started in 2008, with a financial crisis on the other side of the planet. And it started with a decision the entire shipping industry made together. A terrible, expensive, catastrophic decision.
Let me paint you a picture. It's 2007. The global economy is growing. China is manufacturing at a pace nobody has ever seen. Every factory in Shenzhen needs ships. Every retailer in America needs those factories' products. The demand for container shipping is exploding. So what do the shipping companies do? They order ships, lots of them. Not just Hanjin, every major carrier on the planet, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, Evergreen, all of them are ordering massive new vessels. The bigger the ship, the lower the cost per container. That's the logic. Economies of scale. These ships take 2-3 years to build. You order them when times are good. They arrive when things might not be good anymore. And in September 2008, everything stopped. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Credit froze. Trade volumes fell off a cliff. In 2009, global container volumes dropped by approximately 10%, the first time that had happened in the modern era of shipping. But the ships were still being built and being delivered into a world that suddenly didn't need them. The result? Massive overcapacity. Too many ships, not enough cargo. Freight rates crashed to historic lows. You know what that means in practice? A shipping company that charged $2,000 to move a container from Shanghai to Rotterdam was suddenly charging $200, sometimes less. The entire industry was bleeding money. Some companies cut capacity. Some ships were laid up, just anchored at sea, engine off, waiting for better days. Hanjin kept going, kept spending, kept expanding. Here's what was happening inside Hanjin. The company had a particular problem: charter contracts. When you're a shipping company and you don't own all your ships, you rent them. Long-term lease contracts, often 10, 15 years. You sign those contracts when times are good, at good times prices. Then times turn bad, and you're still paying those good times prices for ships you can't fill at freight rates that don't cover your costs. By 2016, Hanjin was locked into charter contracts that cost more than the market rate, sometimes double the market rate. They were paying premium prices to operate ships that were losing money every single trip. By the end of June 2016, Hanjin had approximately $5.5 billion in debt, and counting.
Here's something the chairman of Hanjin said, publicly, after the collapse. He said the shipping industry played a game of chicken. Not his words in private, in public, to Reuters, after everything had already fallen apart. And he was right. But the game of chicken wasn't just between Hanjin and the market. It was between every single carrier. The logic went like this. If I cut capacity by laying up ships, my competitors get my market share. So I won't cut. I'll keep going. And neither will they. And neither will the other guy. And nobody will cut capacity, because they're all waiting for the other guy to blink first. Meanwhile, freight rates collapse further and further and further. Hanjin was losing money. Everyone was losing money. But Hanjin was more exposed. Older ships, more charter contracts, less financial cushion than Maersk or MSC. The Korean Development Bank had been propping them up. In the spring of 2016, the bank invested 1 trillion Korean won, about $910 million, in a restructuring attempt. It wasn't enough. And on August 30th, 2016,
just one day before the bankruptcy filing, the Korea Development Bank made a different decision. They stopped. They pulled the plug. No more money. And just like that, August 31st, 2016, the filing was made. Now, here is where the story stops being about corporate finance and starts being about people. Because 66 ships doesn't mean 66 ships. It means thousands of sailors and $14.5 billion in cargo. And companies all over the world, from small importers to giant retailers, who had no idea where their goods were.
Let me tell you what happened on September 1st, 2016, the day after the filing. Ships that were mid-ocean received their orders. We cannot enter port. Stand by. Ships that were approaching Los Angeles were told to anchor offshore, outside the harbor, waiting. Ships in Asian ports were physically prevented from leaving. Creditors had already obtained arrest warrants. Ports in the U.S., Spain, China, Panama, Canada, all of them refused entry to Hanjin vessels. The logic was simple. If the company couldn't pay its debts, how could it pay docking fees, or the crane operators, or the truckers, or the fuel companies? Nobody was going to work for free. And then there were the sailors. These weren't executives. These weren't shareholders. These were ordinary men and women who had signed on to work 6-month contracts on cargo ships. They had nothing to do with the bankruptcy. They'd done their jobs. But now they were stuck. One ship, the Hanjin Scarlet, arrived at the port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia on August 30th. It managed to unload some cargo. Then it was arrested by creditors, and it stayed at anchor for nearly 2 months. Its 24 crew members had less than 10 days of food left when they were finally allowed to leave. 10 days. In the wealthiest trading nations on Earth, ships full of consumer goods, and the people on board were running out of food. That's not a metaphor. That actually happened. Meanwhile, on land, chaos. Retailers across the United States were panicking. This was August, September. The Christmas shopping season was 3 months away. The National Retail Federation issued a statement saying that merchandise was, quote, in limbo, that retailers were, quote, working hard to make sure it ends up on store shelves in time for the holidays. Companies like Samsung, which had massive shipments of electronics on stranded vessels, were scrambling to reroute. Some moved to air freight at 5-10 times the cost. And the containers already offloaded at ports, those were being held as collateral. Cargo owners who had already paid for their goods were now being told to pay again, demurrage fees, storage fees, just to get access to what was theirs. The rule of law in international shipping, it turned out, was more flexible than most people had assumed. Now you might be wondering, and this is exactly the question I promised to answer at the start. What happened to those 66 ships? Where did they go? And who, if anyone, was held responsible? Because here's the thing. Hanjin collapsed. The ships were eventually released. The cargo was eventually delivered. But the story of who picked up the pieces and what they got in return is not the clean ending you might expect. Stay with me. By mid-September, courts in the US, UK, Germany, and elsewhere had granted Hanjin some protection. Ships could dock to unload cargo without being seized. But protection to unload is not the same as being saved. Korean Air, Hanjin's biggest shareholder with 43% of the company, provided $54 million to help get ships docked and unloaded. That's a meaningful number, but put it in context. The total debt was $5.5 billion. $54 million against $5.5 billion. That's like showing up to a house fire with a glass of water. The rehabilitation plan submitted to the Seoul court was reviewed by Samsung PwC, the accounting firm hired as receiver. Their conclusion was devastating. The company was worth more in liquidation than as a going concern. In other words, the best thing for creditors was to sell everything, divide the money, and shut it down. On February 17, 2017,
Less than 6 months after the bankruptcy filing, the Seoul court made it official. Hanjin Shipping Co., Ltd., bankrupt, liquidated. The fleet was sold off. Some ships went to HMM, Hyundai Merchant Marine, effectively Hanjin's Korean rival. Others went to competitors across Asia and Europe. The Long Beach terminal stake was sold to MSC for an undisclosed sum. The Asia to U.S. route network was sold to Korea Line for $31.4 million. $31 million for a route that had taken decades to build. Creditors had filed claims worth $26 billion against a company with assets worth a fraction of that. Hanjin's 40-year history, over. And the sailors? Many were eventually repatriated, paid their final wages through emergency funds set up under court protection. But hundreds filed claims for unpaid wages and repatriation costs. Many received pennies on the dollar. The people most exposed to the collapse were the ones with the least power over it.
Here's the thing about the shipping industry. It has a very short memory. After Hanjin, everyone agreed this must never happen again. Carriers needed better financial transparency. There needed to be more information sharing, better early warning systems. Some of that actually happened. The biggest structural change was consolidation. Before Hanjin, the top 5 container carriers controlled about 50% of global capacity. After Hanjin, the industry went through a wave of mergers, acquisitions, and alliances. Today, the top 5 carriers control over 70% of global capacity. You might think that's a good thing for stability, and in some ways it is, but it also means less competition, higher rates for shippers, more concentrated risk. When COVID hit in 2020, shipping rates didn't collapse. They exploded, up 400, 500%, because the now consolidated industry had enough pricing power to capitalize on the disruption. The Hanjin collapse, paradoxically, made the surviving carrier stronger, more powerful, more concentrated. And there's one more thing that changed. That Hanjin collapse triggered something in boardrooms all over the world that had nothing to do with shipping. It was a lesson about concentration risk. If one company moving 3% of Pacific trade can throw Christmas shopping into chaos, what does that mean for industries where one supplier controls 40% or 60%? Apple rethought its supply chain after Hanjin. Not directly, Apple wasn't a Hanjin customer, but the principle. What happens when a critical node disappears overnight? That became a boardroom conversation. 6 years later, when COVID exposed those single points of failure at scale, every executive who had forgotten the Hanjin lesson got a very expensive reminder. And now, I promised you something at the start. Something almost nobody mentions when they talk about Hanjin. Here it is. The Korea Development Bank, the state bank that pulled the plug on Hanjin, did something that received almost no coverage outside Korea. When it decided to let Hanjin fail, it simultaneously decided to save a different Korean carrier, Hyundai Merchant Marine, HMM. The bank pumped money into HMM that same year, restructured it, kept it alive. HMM went on to benefit enormously from absorbing Hanjin's former routes and ships. When COVID hit, HMM reported record profits, billions of dollars in profit. And who owns a controlling stake in HMM? The Korea Development Bank. The same institution that chose who lived and who died in 2016 owns the company that benefited most from that choice. Hanjin wasn't just a market failure. It was a policy decision. Someone decided which Korean shipping company the country needed, and they made sure that company survived. Whether that was the right decision, whether Hanjin should have been saved, whether Korea needed 2 major carriers or 1, that's a question economists still debate. What isn't debatable is this: 40 years of Korean maritime history, thousands of jobs, billions in cargo, hundreds of sailors waiting for food. All of it decided in a bank office in Seoul on a Tuesday morning in August 2016. The shipping industry is invisible to most people. The 90% of global trade that moves by sea, it's just how things arrive. We don't think about it. Hanjin showed us what happens when we should have been paying attention. And it won't be the last time. If this story surprised you, And if you've never thought about who's actually moving the things you buy, there's more where this came from. Every week on this channel, we go inside the collapses that shaped the world we live in. Subscribe. The next one is already coming.